So it's up to heaven the Gemara. Ksiv palti. It says palti. Ksiv palti el. Omer Rabbi Yochanan palti shemoi. Really, his name is palti. Walama nikra shemoi palti el. Why was he referred to sometimes with the name paltiel? Shapaltai kale minha avera. Because Baruch saved him from the avera. Only after he made significant ishtadlus. Ma'asa no tzcher beinoy leveino. He put a sword. He plunged the sword into the ground between his bed and her bed, to remind him, to constantly remind himself that she is also to him punishable by death. Omar kalo Isaac b'davar zeh yidaker b'cherb zeh. Correct the Gemara. Vaksiv, how could you tell me, in fact, that he didn't live with her when David HaMelech came into power? He then went and summoned his wife. He wanted to collect Michal. So it says that Palti escorted her to David. Isha, her husband, went with her. Isn't that very much from the fact that there were relations? Zok Gemara, no. Isha. He treated her like a wife, meaning Zok Rashi. He treated her with respect. He took care of her, but he didn't really do ma'aseh issues with her. He was crying. That would sound like they had a marriage that was now breaking up. Till today, he had such an unbelievable mitzvah with schar that was beyond imagination of staying away from her. Now that he's giving her up, he's no longer going to have that mitzvah anymore. And therefore, it was hurting him, either because he's going to lose the opportunity to do the mitzvah, or maybe Hashem doesn't trust me anymore. You see, I did a good job until now. So these are reasons why he was upset. Ad bechurim, shenasu shneim kebechurim. They're both like bechurim, like we never married. Shaloi tamu tambia. It was a pretty awesome feat that Palti pulled off. The big knack of Yosef, that he was once pursued by Eshes Potiphar. But the Mashal says they were of color. They were not pretty. It took a lot of makeup, to maybe even wallpaper, to make them desirable. But it was a great feat, and the Torah makes a big deal about it. But that big deal is Adam V'Sanusa Shaboyaz wasn't even a big deal to Boyaz at all. He had a much bigger than sign. He had a penuya. He woke up with a penuya literally in his bed, and he overcame that. That was a bigger than sign than Yosef, who she was pursuing him, but she wasn't literally in his bed, and she was a penuya. That he didn't have, but that was what Boyaz did. Take for Shaboyaz, and on the Sanusai shall palti beloyish, the quiet triumph that Palti ben Loish had was Toikvoi shall Toikvoi shall Boyaz and V'Sanusai shall Palti ben Loish. Period. Toikvoi shall Yosef and V'Sanusai shall Boyaz. Dichsiv, by Boyaz it says, by he when he woke up and he found that Rus was in his bed, by Yechud Rish v'Yilafas, my v'Yilafas, he was in a terrible mokam of Taiva. Omarav Shanasa Besori Kuroshay Liftois. As Rashi says, Niskasha, his aver became very big. V'Aval Pikein Kabashitra, and he still was able to become Shitra. V'Aval Pisha Pnuya Haisa, and she was a Pnuya, which means there was less Chomer separating him from Rus, and the Ima B'mita, she was right there with him. Aval Yosef, it was a big deal, but it wasn't as big a deal. Aval Yosef Eshish Ish Haisa, the Eina Ima B'mita, and she was a woman of color, and she needed wallpaper just to make her presentable. It's Dr. Gemara right there. Toikvei Shal Boyaz, and the great big deal that Boyaz, the feat that Boyaz pulled off, was on the Sanusha Shal Palta Ben Loish. Was nothing compared to Palta Ben Loish. Kid Amar, like we just said, he lived with her many years, as the Rashi says. Dul Boyaz Chad Laila. It was one night that he had to hold himself back. Palti showed him rabbis. Palti many years he had to exercise tremendous restraint. Kid Amar. It says in the pasuk, Rabbis Banois Asuchoil. Many women had great feats. The At Alisa Al Kalona, but you're the best. Rabbis Banois Asuchoil, Ze Yosef, uboyaz. Yosef Tak accomplished a big deal. Boyaz accomplished a big deal. But Va'at, Palti ben Loish, Olis al Kulona, Ze Palti ben Loish. The Marsha doesn't understand why are we now comparing this to talking about women. Rabbi's we're talking about women over here, not talking about men. That's one of the shows the Marsha has. So the Marsha compares the women over here too, and he says Rabbi's by talking about the godless of the woman. The woman by Yosef's story was Eshes Potiphar. She had only to benefit by being mizavik with Yosef, and the same thing was with Rus. She had only to benefit by being mizavik with Boaz. But Va'at Asal Kalon, Michal Bashol herself was a wonderful, wonderful person because she showed restraint, and she never told her father. Everything was done so quietly. She never told her father about it. The Moshe also adds another element of tremendous nesoinus. In the case of Palti Beloish, you would call it a suffix isser, because although David HaMelech held that there was a good kedushin, milva upruta, daita pruta, and he held that the arlois were of value, that kedushin could be chalik. We learned yesterday. Shol held it wasn't a kedushin, so it was a matzav of suffix isser. It's much, much harder to refrain from a suffix yisr than a vada yisr, and they were able to refrain that way. Zog to Gemara. Grabish business is choil ze Yosef Boyaz. Yadlut hakolon ze palti ben loish. Am Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman am Rabbi Yonason. My dichsiv sheker achein ve'evel hayofi. Sheker achein is referring to Yosef. The hevel hayofi is a Boyaz. Here as Hashem idisalo ze palti ben loish. Dover acher. There's another way to darshan this pasuk. Sheker achein ze doyer shel Moshe, who learned the Torah, who had the Torah, but although they had the Torah, the Mashal speaks out, they weren't zoiche to mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz. They weren't zoiche to mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz. The Hevel HaYofi ze doyer shel Yeshua, who were even zoiche to mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz because they came into Eretz Yisrael. Yeres Hashem Yisrael ze doyer shel Chizkiah, because in the days of Chizkiah, people were very, very learned. As Rashi says, "V'dor shel Chizkiah Yosef k'dichtiv v'choyvel oil mipnei shomen v'aminon b'chelek choyvel oil shel Sanhedrin." How did we break the yoke of Sanhedrin? Mipnei shmono shel Chizkiah shel yadoylek b'vat midrashes. They were burning the midnight oil, as they say, meaning people were ranking and learning. At Shabbat kumidon v'ad Beersheva, they checked over the entire land of Eretz Yisrael v'leimotra amoritz. They didn't find a single amorit in the days of Chizkiah Melech. Dover acher. Sheker Chayin Zedar Shemoshe via Yeshua. They both are a lower level of learning. V'Havla Yofi Zedar Shel Chizkiah, where everybody knew Torah. And Yerush Hashem Yitisalo is Zedar Shel Yehuda B'Rabbaloi, because Amr Elov or Yehuda B'Rabbaloi, that in his time Sheyushisha Talmidim Miskasim B'Talas Echad V'Oishkim V'Torah. They learned Torah b'Mesirus Nefesh. They learned Torah b'Torah great Anios. So that's the highest level of Isha Yerush Hashem Yisrael, which is referring to Klal Yisrael learning Torah. Well, back to the halachas of a melech. Meis lo meis. What if a king loses a loved one and he would technically have to be an ovel? Eina yoytz mipesach palterin shaloi. He doesn't leave his palace. If he wants to go behind the mita, he can go. David went after the meet of Abner. He went to participate in the Levaya. So they told him back that wasn't Avelos, and you don't bring a riot from me. That was a very unique case because the thought that it was David who orchestrated the death of Abner, and therefore they were very upset with him. So therefore he had to make a strong stand to show everybody that he's also Bavelus, and therefore they wouldn't be upset at him, and clearly he wouldn't have been the one to orchestrate the death of Abner. And when they bring him his sudas avora, meaning they bring him food from other people, Kol is subin alert. Everyone sits on the ground. Who made some darkish? And he sits on a darkish, which is some type of small bed that the Gemara is going to discuss exactly what it is. In places where the woman wouldn't walk in front of the mace, they'd walk behind the mace. There, the king is yoiches lefnei mita because he doesn't stand where the women's there. Okay. So wherever they go, that's where they're supposed to go, and they're not supposed to deviate. They're supposed to go into their place. So there's a shaila why they would go before the mita, why they would go after the mita. So they would go before the mita, and the tzad that they go after the mita is so that men should look at them, so they'll be behind. The tzad that they go before the mita, I'm not sure why. There's a discussion as to why they would be in each position. What did he say?
Women be the funeral possession because it was the first woman child who brought death to the world.
So they're responsible. Everyone should see it's their fault. Okay, good. You always need someone to blame for everything. They always go out before the mita. You see that women must go in front of the mita because David went after the mita, and surely David wouldn't have went with the women. That's not a raya because David had to be Matthias the nation, and it worked. Just like the Rav, he first speaks by the men, then he goes speaks by the women. David actually made sure to attend the Levaya, both by the Eden and both by Ezra's Noshim, because he wanted everyone to know that he was available, even the woman. Says Abner. So he needed to go to the ladies also. Why? Because if he didn't go to the ladies are going to come home and say, "Oh, David must have killed Abner." This is what her husband will say. What do you mean? He was by the Levaya, but he didn't come to the ladies. So vice the Goyis, he really doesn't like Abner. Zok to Gemara weiter. Dorish Rova. My dechsiv. It says in the pasuk, "Vayovoi kol ha'am lahavroi," says David. Everybody came to bring the Sudas Havor to David. He sort of be menachem. Ksiv lahachrois. It says lahachrois. They came to cut him. They came to attack him. But the karina and lahavrois. So the ksiv is with a chaf, and the kri is with a hey. They originally were very angry at him when Avner was killed, but then they saw, in fact, that he felt bad about it, meaning it was not him. Let's have a look at Rashi. So you swear it came from David Amelach. David Nereg Avner. How did they know? Because he was there by the Levi.
Why do they have to be David?
Because he wasn't technically one of the family. I guess he was acting like one of the family, because he wanted to show that he was Mamish Bavelis. I guess he played as a novel. Mamish played as Greg Lovin. So they brought him a Sudas Havor, but you're asking a good point. Sudas Havor is a halachic thing that the one of the 7 Krovim doesn't eat from their own food. I don't know. That's a very good order. Amar Yehuda Amar Rav. Avner. Why was Avner punished? When Shaul decided that he wants to kill Noivir HaKayanim, Avner was in a position of influence. He had, as we say, he had Shaul's ear, and he didn't protest, and therefore he was punished, and that's why he died. Livchos b'Shaul zokt Rashi b'harigas Noivir HaKayanim. At that point, he would have been able to convince Shaul otherwise. What do you mean? Of course he was moicha, but v'loy nena. Shaul didn't listen to him, so it's not his fault. And they both dash in the same pasuk and extract a different understanding from it. It says V'yakonin hamelach as Abner. David HaMelech was being misable over Abner. And he said, Takamois novel, like a criminal, Yomas Avner's dying. Yodecha lo asurais, your heads were not tied. Raglecha lo nechashtayim hukshu, and your legs aren't in iron restraints. So this is what the pasuk says. So man the Amar loy micha, if he was punished, he did an avla because he wasn't moicha. Hachik Amar. This is what David HaMelech meant to say. Yodecha lo asurais, your hands were not tied. And your legs weren't restrained. My time why weren't you moicha? Therefore, as a punishment, you fell just like somebody who does something wrong falls because you did an avla. But if he did what he could, he was moicha, and he wasn't answered. So then this is how he would read the pasuk. It's moyim atma. It's a question. Hakamois novel yomos. Should you die like a criminal? Yodecha lo yasurais, v'raglecha lo lenachashtem. You didn't restrain yourself. Adarabah, michti. Let's see. Mechuyu moches. You actually did protest. My timer can foil b'nei b'nei falta. Why? So he was asking it by the question. He was crying. You did everything right. Why did you fall? If you hold he was moicha, so my time he ended. So why Taka was Abner killed? Why did he die? He caused that Malchus Beis David should be delayed from starting 2.5 years. Rashi and Tosfos have two different calculations as to when these 2.5 years was. Let's see Rashi, and then I'll just speak out Tosfos. Malchus Beis David shehemed as Ishboishes lamelech. Originally, after Shaul died, they appointed Shaul's son as the king. The Mloyim Lichu Avner, had Avner not put Ishboishes, not stood behind his boishes to treat him like a king, Hayim Mamlichin as David, they would have been Mamlech David right away. After Ishboishes finished, Umishamalach Ishboishes, Ajoim Shamalach David, Al Kol Yisrael, Hayushtei Shanim Umechta. And even after Ishboishes finished, there was another 2.5 years. Shtei Shanim Ishboishes. There was 2 years of the rule of Ishboishes. He was king for 2 years, and then the Chatzi Shana, and then there was another half a year bein Misasoi LaMalchus David between the time that he died and they actually gave David the full Melucha. Shemishamei Shaul Malach David bechevron. As soon as Shaul died, David Melech had a Malchus in Chevron, but he was not accepted yet by all of Klal Yisrael. Before David HaMelech became Melech of all of Klal Yisrael, there's a 7.5 year gap from when Shaul died, and during that 7.5 years, he was only running his Malchus in Chevron. Take away 5 years, because it took 5 years till Ishboishes became king. For 5 years, there was a power vacuum. The Tanya would say to Olam, Vayom Asher Molach David, Nimtzis Malchus Yisrael B'Teila Chameshanim. For 5 years, there was nobody. There was a dead man. Alma Chameshanim Hayibulay Melech. For 5 years, there was no king. Nishtayru Shtei Shanim Umechta. Now there's 2.5 years left that have to be accounted for in the gap of 7.5 years between the Malchus of Shaul and the Malchus of David. Mamlechus Ishboishes, the Malchus Beis David. So there's 2.5 years that was the Mamlechus of Ishboishes, the Malchus Beis David, but he was only king 2 years, so there's a half a year. So because of Avner, it was pushed up 2.5 years. Tosfos says, what do you mean 2.5 years? It was pushed up much more, because he should have made David king right away. But Tosfos spins the dates around. He said that Ishboishes became king right away, and after he became king, it was a 5.5 year gap. That wasn't Avner's fault anymore at 5 years, because Ishboishes was out of power. So Tosfos is a little bit of a different cheshbon, but either way, Avner was held responsible for 2.5 of those 7 years, of those 7.5 years. Zok to Gemara, when you bring a Sudas Avor to the king, rather than the oval sitting on the floor and the Menachem sitting on chairs, it was the opposite. So my dargish, what is this dargish that the Mishnah is telling us the Melech sat on? Amarula Arso de Gada. You know what it is? It's an Arso de Gada. Rashi teaches Dargish Arsha the Gada. Now, Hagan Hoyu Larich Mita V'Shulchan Abayis. They used to have like a fake for show only bed and table. They didn't use them, they were just for show. El Mazel Habayis Munachas was there because it brought a good mazel to the house. Mishum Nichush, because of the people who are menachesh, it protects the house from a zikin. God does mazel. Okay. It cannot be that this is pshat. Mi kamidi the adha idna lo yusvine the hashta moisvina late. Are you telling me that up until now, as Rashi says, at hashalah v'svina athena lo yoshav aloy semita? Is it possible that there's a bed that was never used anyway, it wasn't made for sitting? You're making now sit on a new bed that wasn't even made for sitting. That's not logical to say. Maskav Rova, my kush, I don't know what the problem is. Dilma midi de hava achila v'shtia. It's no different than eating and drinking. The other idna lo yachilnei v'lo yashkinei. Until now, people didn't give him food. He ate from his own food. Hashta, because by the Sudas Avara, so he's doing something completely different from what he was doing up until now. Ella ikasha, if you want to have a kasha on this dargo, that it can't be this bed that was for show, hakasha. Dargish einoi tzarich l'kvoisei. A dargish, the halacha tells us, you don't have to turn it over. Beds have to be turned over in the houses. Supposedly, the minhag to cover mirrors also comes from turning over a bed. I guess to put down the koyach of Adam, to bring down their level. So dargish enei tzarich l'kvoisei, you don't have to turn it over. Rather, elazoikvoi, you stand it up. You saw the arsha de gada. If it's an arsha de gada that you don't sit on anyway, it's not for show. Why shouldn't you have to turn it over? Why should it be different than any other bed? Latanya, when you turn over your bed for Avelis, which we don't do anymore, so why would this be any different? Why would this be any different at all? So therefore, it can't be an Arsha de Gada, because an Arsha de Gada you would turn over. You shouldn't have to turn over. So Dr. Gemara, my question, but also I can say it's not a kasha. It should be no different than a mita that's miyuchedes l'kelim, meaning it's not used for people, which you don't have to turn over. So maybe that's why you don't turn it over. Eli kasha, if you want to say that it can't be an arsha de gada, there's a different reason why. Hakasha, Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, dargish on a dargish. You're matir the karvit. You don't turn it over. Rather, you untie the ties that hold up the platform where the mattress would be placed, which was just a flat piece of leather, and it would be tied to the head and footboards and the sideboards to hold it up. You would just untie it, and it would fall by itself on the floor. Arsha de Gada, if it was Arsha de Gada, karvit mi islay, it didn't have these types of straps. Mata karvit Rashi says, you open up these loops that you attach the flat piece of leather to the sides. But karvit mi islay, it didn't have it. This dargish was made like a regular bed. It didn't have these loops that would only exist in a different type of bed. But since we're talking about a dargish, your mater karvitin, it means the dargish must have karvitin. But this special bed that we're talking about that was there for show didn't have karvitin. It looked like a regular bed. The karvitin Eloki also Rabin Omar Lee. He told me, Yosy Rabin Omar, he said, Omar Lehumer Rabbanim, a member of the Rabbanim, one of the Rabbanim told me, he was often in the shuk of the people who make straps, the people who deal with leather. They told him, my dargish arso ditzala. What's an arso ditzala? Zokt Rashi, mita shalor, it is still a bed made out of hide. The toilet ritzois bisvasa arso, all the way around this slab of leather, there's fringes. And when they want to set it up, they tie all of these straps that are all the way around to the two sideboards of the bed to hold it up, to connect it to the sideboards. And when they just untie it, it just falls down. Those are these kavitin, these loops that allow us to tie the leather slab to the bedpost. He doesn't want to turn it over. What surface do you lie on? What surface do you use? The upper side of the leather. If you turn it over, that leather is going to be on the earth and it's going to ruin the leather. So what he'd rather do is just untie it and let it fall to the floor so its bottom surface will touch the floor and that won't mess it up. The four legs weren't so high, or they weren't higher than the flat part. So if you turned it over, the leather would mamish be touching the bed. If it's a headboard and a footboard, when you turn it over, it still wouldn't, the leather wouldn't touch the floor. But if it didn't have a headboard, it was like a high riser, you turned it over, the leather would be sitting right on the floor. The comment on the comma, what do you do? All you do is you stand the bed up on its end, either on its footboard or on its headboard. So again, you don't have to let it fall down to the floor. Shimon said you just untie it. So either you stand it up, and if Shimon said you could tie it, but that's what we're talking about, some type of portable type of bed that that didn't have a headboard and a toe board, and therefore you didn't want to turn it upside down. Dargish, a dargish, sirugai mitoichai. When you tie it, it's mitoichai, meaning sheyesh nekavim ba'arkavosav. There are holes in its legs. Mitoichin vahen rasha ritzuyais. At least by winding, you slide them through the holes in the footboard, then you tie them up, and that's how they hold. If there's holes in the legs, then you could pull some of the leather straps through there and tie it and fasten it that way. If there's no holes, what you would do is you would take the straps and you would wrap them over the sideboards around, and you'd wrap them around and around, and that's what would hold it up. So siruga mitoicha, meaning it had holes, you didn't have to wrap it around the sideboard. Mita, but a regular bed is siruga me'al gaba, you would wrap it over and around. Which means the difference is that on this regular mita, you didn't see the sideboards because they were wrapped around with leather. Masheken, the dargish, you actually did see the sideboards. Measure fact to the more. When is a kliyetz mekabel tuma? When do we say it's nigmar de malacha? Zok gemar hamita of arisa bed is misha yeshufam ba'arhadan. The skin of a fish was used in those days as sandpaper. It was like the Flintstones. They used that as sandpaper. So therefore, when is the bed complete? When is the wooden keli complete? When you sanded it. The imita mesureges me'al gaba. But if the sideboards are completely wrapped around with the straps, lamali shivas arhadag. It's a surface that you don't see. It's a rough surface. So why do you need to sandpaper down the sideboards if anyway they're going to be covered over with leather? You must say that even a regular bed, there's holes in the sideboards that you could run the leather straps through to hold it up, and therefore you do need to sand the top of the headboards to make them nice and smooth. Rather, mita ule vafuke bizjoni. There's grooves in the sideboards that you could keep the leather in. Maybe they don't stick out past the surface of the board. And dargish ule vafuke bafkosa. There you have to, as Rashi says, lulois hatluyois v'nekavei aruchosav. There's loops that are connected to the legs. Uvehen machnisin rasha ritzuyos hatluis b'svasor. So instead of threading them through the sideboard and back, and there's like a groove that they write out of the wood to hold the leather, there was actually a loop. Does the article give a better explanation of how these beds were put together? Okay, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. We pass like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, as Rabbi Shimon said on Amud Aleph. Shimon Gamliel said, "Dargish mater karvitin v'noifel me'elov." You don't have to You don't have to turn it over. You could just let them fall down. Okay, Zok Gemara weiter. Amar Biakabar Ami Mito Shadak Litel Yoitzin. You want to turn over your bed, but they were beds that had either a canopy or had not a canopy with 4 posts, but a canopy with 2 posts. How you can turn a bed over like that? You can't balance it on the 2 posts. It's impossible. So therefore, all you have to do is stand it up on its headboard or on its footboard, and that would be enough to take care of the turning over the bed. Zok Tahele de Gemara weiter. Umoitzi lemelchemes harashus.
What's the verse of prayer? Should it sit on it? Or just
We don't do that nowadays.
Yeah.
We don't do it. We don't do it.
Just don't throw the bed.
Well, you not sit up high, but it wasn't about sitting up high. All the beds in the house, even the beds that you didn't use, turned over, is a sign of availance. Rabbi Rajan spoke that I forgot the link, but he said that today what we do is we cover our mirrors and we also cover pictures of the nifter. That's what we do. I think it's like sort of subdues the human class.
No,
It depends what you see when you look in the mirror. The king leads us out as we already learned that we need a bezin of shivim vechad to authorize a milchemes rishos. And the milchemes rishos is anything besides the milchama that Yeshua did when he took Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. Uparitz lashes loderach. If he needs a pathway to go somewhere, he can break everything in his way. And no one can protest. A king who needs to make a pathway and clear a way for himself, he could make it as big as he wants to, and anything in his path, he could build those. Correct? If there's a war and the soldiers in Klal Yisrael are able to grab spoils of the war, they have to contribute to the king. We'll see how much. And he gets to pick from anything that he wants. He gets first pick of it. Did we not already learn in the first Mishnah of Sanhedrin, in the first pair, yes, but I did the Tana call me the Melech. Since now we're elaborating on the halachas of the king, Tananami Maitzin Malchemes Rishos. The Gemara, the Tana once again mentions this a lot. Amar B'Damar Shmuel. Kol Amar B'Parshas Melech Muterboy. When Klal Yisrael asked Shmuel Hanavi for a king, Shmuel said, "Do you really want a king? You know what he'll be able to do to you? He'll be able to do this and that." And Shmuel gave him a whole list, like a threatening list. If you're going to get a king, it's going to cost you big time because there's so many things he's allowed to take away from you. You're sure you really want it? So Zokt, Rabbi Shmuel, that wasn't false threats. That was very real. That's Takid Halacha. All of those things that Shmuel said that Klal Yisrael might suffer under a king is actually halacha. The king can do those things. But Rav Amar loy never parshazu elul ayam alayim. He was just doing it to scare them off. And Rashi says, Rav Amar loy never parshazu Shmuel elul ayam alayim shetei emes malcham alayim. So you should fear the king. He's not really allowed to do it. I just wanted to put the fear of the king in the people. Kitanoi, we have a machloikas tonight. Rabbi Yosy Yomer kol amar b'parshas melach muter boy. Rabbi Yehuda Yomer lo never parshazu elo kedei la ayim aleim shneimar soim tosam alach hamelech ketehei mosay alech. Rabbi Yehuda used to also say, this is a very, very, very well-known controversial sugya, and this is where the Tziyonim and the Satmar Rebbe tumul over whether what we have now is Reishis Smichas Geula Seinu. Whether today's times after Klal Yisrael won the 6-day war, if that's called Aschalta de Geula or not. I know the Satmar Rebbe held not, and the Tziyonim hold yes. So V'chein hayir Rabbi Yehuda would say, Gimel mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael b'chnisason la'aretz. There were 3 mitzvahs that Klal Yisrael had when they got into Eretz Yisrael. Lahamid lahamelech, they have to set up a melech, and it's in this order specifically. Ulahachri zari shalom molek, they have to destroy the zera molek. But live nois lam beis habechira. right after the 6 Day War, when we took over Klal Yisrael, there was a discussion. Are we now in Yosy Mashiach? Maybe we have to start building the Beis Hamikdash. So the Poskim Paskin, that's only if you were already Lahach Zar Shalom Alek. But even after the 6 Day War, they were still surrounded by enemies. And therefore, we were not yet at the point, being that it has to be done in order, we were not yet ready to build the Beis Hamikdash. We know that we did not yet have a chiyuv to build the Beis Hamikdash because we were not yet Kairos Zar Shalom Alek. And the tumult that came out over here was the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam mentions it mufurish as a mitzvah, but the Rambam does not mention the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a standalone mitzvah, and that's the Satmar Rebbe's raya that there's no such mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. But the Tziyonim go bus or many other poskim who explain the Rambam that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is included in some other mitzvahs. Like V'chalta B'sot V'rachta, you have to have al-arth ha-tovish and as-alach in order to be thankful for the land. You got to be there. So there's a lot of different shittas in where the Rambam's chiyuv of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael comes from, but some of them, of course, Rambam will learn that there is no mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which is where the Satmar Rebbe brought his raya from. Okay. V'amret asima lai melech. Tanya, Rabbi Lezer Omer, Zekenim Shebedar, Kahoydin Shal. When they asked, when the Zekenim of the Dor in the times of Shmuel asked for a melech, there was not an avla. What they did was appropriate. Shenemer t'na lonu melech l'shavteinu. We want a melech l'shavteinu. I'm sorry? You're right, I did. Thank you very much. I did skip that. The only reason why the Torah tells us about the halacha of the melech, because the Torah tells us about a melech. Even before the Torah of Shmuel, it's only if they tarumoson shenemar v'amarta simulai melech. If you're going to want a melech, you can make a melech. So in order that Klal Yisrael can have tinus, because Baruch Hu put that mitzvah in the Torah, but not that it's really a good thing to do. Tanya Rabbi Lezer Omer Zekenim Shebedar Kahoydin Shalu Shenemar T'na lonu melech l'shavteinu, to enforce the Torah, to raise up the level of Torah in Klal Yisrael. That's appropriate. Avol Amaya Aretz Sheben Kilkalu. They had the wrong intention. Shenemar Vayinu Gam Anachnu Chol Hagoyim. They want to be like every other nation, to have a king fight our wars. V'shavteinu Malkeinu v'yetzel lefaneinu. So if that's why you're asking for a king, that would be enough. Tanya Yosy Omer Shalosh Mitzvos Nestav.
I just want to point out one thing, if you don't mind. There's a pasuk in Sefer Bereshis that Elah HaMelachim Asher Molchu Be'eretz Edom Lifnei Molach Melech Libnei Yisrael. So these are the ones that the kings for Edom before there were kings in Eretz Yisrael. So they had to know that there's going to be a king in Eretz Yisrael. So when they asked for a king, all they had to do is look at this pasuk and saying there's going to be a king.
I mean, so why was it an avla? They knew that
That's right.
There was going to be a king. Right. So I think that's why the Gemara tells us is the king that the Torah is referring to is a king who's going to, his purpose is going to be Mechazek Torah and Klal Yisrael. They wanted a king to be like all the other nations.
Yeah, there were some that wanted, but others not. Anyway.
Okay, and as I say, the rest is history.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Okay, says Dr. Gemara, Tanya B'Yosy Omer Shalosh Mitzvos Nitztavu Yisrael B'Chnisason La'aretz. And what were they? Lahamid Lahamelech, Ulahachris Zaroi Shalamalek, V'Livnois Lahem Beis HaBechira. You know, there's a shaila in the bracha of Yerushalayim Ircha. What do we say? Yerushalayim Ircha Berachim Toshav. It's just Kumsach Hashem Divarta. And then we stick a line in there that has nothing to do with Yerushalayim. What does that do to anything? There's a bracha on Yerushalayim. At Tzemach David, we're talking about reestablishing Malchus David. But the reason for it is because going into Eretz Yisrael is only considered going into Israel when we're under the Malchus Beis David, as we see here, that the three mitzvahs that are triggered when Klal Yisrael goes into Israel is Lahamid Lahan Melech, L'Achar Shalom Melech, V'Livnos Beis HaBechira. Just adding to what David said earlier, about the fact that they were kings of the Goyim before the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, and they knew that they were going to be taking over with their kings at the time. But it's more than that. There was a whole big shaila. Do we have now Malchus in Eretz Yisrael? Because you see now we're controlling Israel. So there are those who said that's not called Malchus. It's only when it's with a king that's Shem Torah mitzvahs, not when we have a secular government. And there's a whole shaila, if a democracy, a secular government could be considered a malchus, so Moshe also would be a malchus, even though it's not a dictatorship, but it's a democracy, but it's still a malchus. And they bring a push to Raya. Were all the kings of Klal Yisrael through the Vim, were they Orthodox? Was Achav an Orthodox who made everyone do an Avodah Zarah? Was Yerovam? There are so many kings that were not Orthodox at all. So don't tell me it's not proper Malchus Beis David because they're not writing Al Pei Torah. Many kings in the times of the Navi was not Al Pei Torah. Malchus Yisrael. But whatever, they were the kings there. Right? So you see, you could be a king. I don't know all Malchus, I think they were all good. We don't know what is the order of operations. That shows that the order is that you first establish a king. Why? Because the Enkise el Melech. Yod al Kes Kaz referring to setting up a Melech. Shneor v'Yeshav Shloim al Kise Hashem l'Melech. V'adayin en Yidea. So, and then only after that is Milcham Hashem b'Amalek. That's when you kill out a Amalek. But v'adayin en Yidea im livnois lebeis habechir tchila or lahachar zarish l'Amalek tchila. How do we know that we shouldn't be building the Beis Hamikdash even though we have not yet destroyed our enemies? And then it says, so you see, first we have to destroy our enemies, and only then can we engage in building the Beis Hamikdash. And Hashem let him have a little bit of menucha from the enemies around. Then and there's no Beis Hamikdash. So you see, the time to build the Beis Hamikdash is once we are living with Shalva, no longer threatened by our enemies, which should happen b'meher v'yameinu. Amar Shlokish b'tchila malach Shlomo el Yod. When Shlomo took on Malchus, he was on a very high madrega. He was even king over the upper spheres that I don't know what those are. They're beyond our pay grade. Shenemar v'yosher Shlomo al kisei Hashem. But as he did a various, because he took Bas Paroi as a wife, then Malach al Tachtonim, he was cut down to only be a Melech on the world. Shenemar Kuroide Bechol Evar Anor Mitivsach Vad Aza. That was like my Hoidu Vat Kush. It includes the whole world. Rav Shmuel Chadam Mitivsach B'Soif Oilam. V'Aza B'Soif Oilam. So there's two ends of the world. So everything in between is what David was king over. They're right together. And what it meant to say is just like he had tight control on these two cities. At the end, Yisrael. Shlomo HaMelech's Malchus started to contract. He was only Melech on Klal Yisrael. Shenemar ani kahelas hayisi Melech al Yisrael. Ulubasayf lo Melech el al Yerushalayim. Shenemar diver kahelas ben David Melech b'Yerushalayim. He only was in control of his own bed. He only had control over his stick. That's when the shade threw him away and exiled him. Rav Ushmuel. One said it means a stick literally. It means his coat. Hadar After Shlomo Melech was banished from the Malchus, did he ever get reestablished or not? Zok to Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel, Chadam or Hadar, Chadam or Hadar. One holds he got back, one holds he didn't come back, and there's a question as to whether or not it's a Machlik Shemitzias, or maybe how do you classify coming back? How do you classify coming back to power? Mandam or Hadar was a Melech and then he was a Hedjit. Mandam or Hadar, he was a Melech, the Hedjit, and then he was once again a Melech. Okay, I really wanted to push to the Mishnah, but it's Mamish 52 already. So what does the item say? We stop? Okay, we'll stop with Mamish tomorrow. Thank you. Beautiful.
For
No problem.
Mamish never knew, like, I
I knew him, but I haven't seen him. I didn't really